here's what's happening. The ACT recently made policy changes that most families haven't caught up with yet. These are not just minor tweaks. They directly affect how colleges calculate scores. And if your junior is planning to take the ACT this year, you need to know something. The test you remember, the one that your older kids may have taken, doesn't work the same way anymore. And I've already seen students lose acceptance points because their parents didn't know what has changed. My name is Anya Ilkys. I'm a founder and CEO of College Starpoint, an expert college admissions consulting practice. We work primarily with families who are navigating this process for the first time or who have had older kids go through it a few years ago and are now realizing the landscape has shifted underneath them. And here's what's happening. The ACT recently made policy changes that most families haven't caught up with yet. And these are not just minor tweaks. They directly affect how colleges calculate scores, which tests get superscored, and whether students can even skip sections without consequences. If you're basing your advice on what worked with your older child, on what you have heard from other parents, you might be setting up your junior up for a lower composite score than they have actually earned. And you won't even know it until it happened and it's too late. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly what changed with the ACT and why it's creating hidden traps for unprepared families and whether your junior should still take it or pivot for the SAT entirely. So let's start with the first thing that changed, superscoring. Your older kid might have taken the ACT 3 times and superscored their way to a 34. Your junior can't do that at most schools anymore, and here's why. Superscoring used to be standard ACT strategy. You'd have your kid take the test multiple times, mix and match their best section scores from different test dates, and colleges would calculate a new composite from these top scores. If they got a 34 in English on one test but a 32 in math, then later got a 35 in math and a 33 in English, no problem. You'd submit both tests and the college would take the 34 in English and the 35 in math, and that's how it worked. That strategy is disappearing. More and more colleges now only consider scores from a single ACT test date. They won't superscore across multiple sittings, and most families don't realize it until after their junior has already registered for the test. This isn't about the testing getting harder, it's about colleges changing their policies and how they evaluate ACT scores. And what this means is that students have fewer safety nets, and one bad test date or a week or a section or otherwise strong test can be easily fixed by retaking and mixing scores. If your junior has an off day in math and nails English and science, they're stuck with that math score dragging down the composite for any school that doesn't superscore. I had a student last year whose mother kept telling me, it's fine, we just superscore it, like we did it with her brother, except 3 out of the 5 schools on her list had changed their policies since her brother applied 2 years earlier. By the time they started working with me and realized what had happened, they already used up 2 of her ideal testing dates. And if your junior is counting on superscoring to boost their ACT composite, you need to check each target school's policy before they register for the first test. Don't assume it works the way it used to. Pull up the testing requirements page for every college on their list and look specifically for the ACT superscoring language. If it says single sitting or highest composite from one test date, that's your answer. And if most of their schools don't superscore, that's a signal you might want to reconsider and take the SAT, because SAT is still widely superscored. Second, the science section is now optional, which sounds great until you realize that optional actually means not optional. ACT science optional at some colleges is still required, and others required for some majors. Most students have no idea which bucket their school falls into. Students can now choose whether or not to take it. And on the surface, that sounds like a win. Fewer sections means fewer stress, right? Except optional doesn't mean irrelevant. Some colleges still require it, others strongly recommend it. and some only require it for specific majors like engineering, pre-med, or STEM programs. Here's the trap. As students might skip the science to simplify their test date only to find out later that their top choice school needed it or that their intended major required it, even though the general application didn't. I had this happen a few months ago. A student takes the ACT without the science in the fall, feels good about it, submits the applications in November, and then in January, one of the school emails asking for the ACT score that includes the science because he applied to the engineering program. He didn't know that was the requirement because it wasn't listed in the general admissions requirements, and it was buried in the engineering specific FAQ. He had to retake the entire test, which meant waiting for the scores, which delayed his application review, which, whether actually it hurt his chances or not, created unnecessary stress and uncertainty during a time where he should have been focused on keeping up his grades and finishing strong in high school. So before your junior registers for the ACT, you need to pull up the testing requirements for every school on their list and check whether science is required, recommended, or truly optional. And if they're applying to any STEM or pre-med programs, assume that it's required unless school specifically says otherwise. Don't let them skip it by default just because ACT says it's optional. The colleges don't all agree. Third, and this is the one that really matters, colleges don't calculate ACT composite scores the same way anymore. Your junior can take the same ACT and end up with different composite scores depending on which college recalculates it. I've seen students lose a full point or more because of this. Traditionally, the ACT composite scores was calculated by averaging 4 sections: English, math, reading, and science. Straightforward. You look at the scores report, you see the composite, and that's the number the colleges use. Not anymore. Now, because the science is optional, colleges have to decide whether to include it in the composite calculation or not. And they don't all make the same decision. Some schools still include science, some don't. Some only include it if the student took it, and some recalculate the composite entirely based on their own formula. This means that the same test performance, the same section scores, can result in different composite score depending on which college is reviewing the application. I've already seen this happen. A student with a 32 composite on the ACT's official calculation ended up with a 31 on a certain schools because of how they recalculated it. And that's not rounding error, that's a meaningful difference in how competitive application looks. And here's what makes this so frustrating. There's no centralized way of how colleges recalculate it. And we have to dig into each school's admissions website sometimes, emails the admissions office directly, and piece together how they're handling it. Most parents don't have time to do this. Most students don't even know how it's happening. So they submit their applications assuming their 32 is a 32 everywhere. And then they wonder why they got waitlisted at schools where they thought they were well above the median. You can't just look at your junior's ACT score report and assume that's the number colleges will see. You need to understand how each target school recalculates the composites, and if that process drops their scores, it might be worth pivoting to the SAT entirely, because the SAT doesn't have this problem. The score you see is the score colleges use. No recalculations, no surprises. So if all that sounds unnecessarily complicated, it is, and that's exactly why I'm recommending the SAT to more students than I used to. The ACT used to be neck and neck with the SAT. In all of these policy changes, the SAT is now the clearer, more predictable choice for most students. The core advice hasn't changed. Students should take the tests where they'll score higher. Colleges genuinely don't prefer one test over the other. So if your student is going to get a 35 on the ACT and a 1480 on the SAT, take the ACT, no question. But the ACT has added so much complexity. The selective superscore, the optional but not really optional science section, inconsistent composite calculations. It's all becoming harder to plan around. The SAT doesn't have these issues. It's more of a standardized in how colleges evaluate it. Superscoring is widely accepted. There are no optional sections that might disqualify a student from programs later. The score you earn is the score colleges see. That's predictability that matters when you're trying to build an application timeline and testing strategy that actually works. I used to tell families, take both tests and see where your kid does better and then focus there. And still, that's a good advice if your junior has the time and energy for it. But if you're already stretched thin and if you're taking multiple APs and doing extracurriculars, trying to keep up their grades, you're asking me which test to prioritize, I'm leaning towards the SAT. It's less likely to create unexpected complications 6 months from now when they're finalizing their applications and in a process where there are already 1,000 moving parts you cannot control. Eliminating unnecessary complexity is worth something. If you're realizing right now that you don't have a clear testing strategy or that the one that you had was based on what worked 3 years ago, or you may need test prep or tutoring help, this is exactly the kind of thing that we help families navigate. We work one-on-one with high school students and their parents to build timelines, choose the right tests, set them up with the right tutors so that they can avoid the kinds of mistakes that quietly kill applications. That sounds like something that you may need. Check the links in the description to learn more about how we can work together. Okay, my final point is testing isn't just a box to check. It's one of the few objective data points colleges use to compare students across different high schools, different states, and different grading systems. It's how colleges compare them to students from completely different schools. And a 1-point difference can shift them from a maybe to a yes. Colleges use standardized test scores as a way to level the playing field. A 4.0 GPA in high school may not mean the same thing as a 4.0 GPA at another high school. Class rank vary widely depending on how competitive the school is. But a 1450 on an SAT or 33 on an ACT is a 1450 and a 33 where a student lives. That means test scores carry real weight, especially at schools that are test required or test flexible, where submitting a strong score can help even if it's not mandatory. If a student ends up with a lower composite score than what they actually earned because their family didn't understand how colleges recalculate ACT scores, they've just made their application less competitive, though at not fault their own. That's exactly the kind of invisible mistakes that families don't realize that they made until it's too late. And by then, there's no way to undo it. You can't call the admissions office and say, wait, we didn't know you were going to recalculate the composite. That's not how it works. Once the application is submitted, the score is the score. I see this happen every year. Parents who thought they were doing everything right, researching the schools, visiting the campuses, helping their kids craft the essays, only to find out in March that their testing strategy had a blind spot that they didn't even know existed. You can't afford to operate on outdated information when it comes to testing strategy. The policies changed. The landscape is different. And if you're not adjusting your approach, your junior is the one who pays the price. The good news is that once you know what to look for, you can avoid these traps entirely, but you have to be willing to question what you think you know and verify every assumption before your junior sits for that first test. Now let's recap. ACT used to be just as straightforward as SAT, but recently the policy changes. Fewer schools are superscoring, optional science sections that aren't actually optional, and inconsistent composite recalculations have made it significantly more complicated. For most students, the SAT is now the more simpler, safer choice. But here's what I didn't cover in this video, is how do you know that your junior is ready to take either of the tests? And what happens if they take the test too early and it tanks their confidence? Or worse, gets locked into their applications because they didn't know they could cancel the score. Now that you understand why the ACT got so much more complicated, you need to know when your junior should actually take their first test and how to avoid these mistakes that can permanently damage their score profile. For more college admissions tips, subscribe to my channel and follow me on social media. See you soon.